People often ask if it's tough being a criminal prosecutor. We have so much negativity going on. And sometimes it is, especially now in times like this when I think we're all feeling a little bit despondent about the situation after post the election in the US and the situation here. But being a prosecutor also gives me very concrete tools to do something about the injustice and the suffering that I'm seeing. So that also gives some hope in that sense. My job has three main components. The first is that to investigate hate crimes and hate speech on a national level. I'm the national prosecutor against discrimination in the Netherlands. So these are the main components, the types of cases that I deal with. And not rarely this involves putting some of our politicians on trial. My team and I, we often say that we delineate the outer borders of freedom of speech. So the people outside here today, they're exercising their right to freedom of speech, and our job is to delineate that, to make sure that everyone stays within the outer boundaries. And we protect the rights of minorities, and in that way, we promote a fair and safe society for everybody. The second part of my job is to chase the bad guys that actually commit these crimes. Wiretaps, forensics, the middle of the night stakeouts, we do all of it. Well, okay, maybe the police do the actual stakeout I supervise, but still, it's very exciting. And as thrilling as this sort of CSI part of my job is, the hardest part is actually the third part, and that's the part that starts in court, in the courtroom. And I sit there in my toga, my case files prepared, and in come the defendants and the victims, and with all their stories and emotions come flooding in. So when I started as a prosecutor some 15 years ago, I would come to court prepare to present my case in a calm, rational, distantiated way, which was the way that I'd been trained to do it. But more and more, I became familiarized with the people sitting in front of me, with the defendants and the victims. And most of the hundreds of people that I've seen in court have at some point in their life experienced abuse, trauma, violence, or psychological disorders. And so I often found myself in this very uncomfortable position where on the one hand, I have a job to do and a task to complete. And on the other hand, I found myself experiencing empathy and compassion for the people that I was set to prosecute. Now, this discomfort continued for some time until at some point it really became too much to bear. And this really came to a head in one particular case that took place about 10 years ago. And this case became the beginning of a decade-long exploration into that discomfort. The case concerned a situation of domestic abuse being tried before a full court of 3 jurors. And the violence was striking. And because it had taken place in a bar, it had been filmed, so we could all study carefully the details of him beating her with anything that he could get hold of. And as you can imagine, this was awful to watch for all of us. And the defendant shrank away more and more with each question from the judges. They wanted to understand what had possessed him, a man with no prior record, sitting timidly in the courtroom, closed and quiet throughout the hearing. And so the judges, they asked him provocative questions, trying to pull it out of him, and frustrated that they weren't getting the answers they were looking for. And as I watched this play out, I leaned back and I realized this line of questioning isn't getting us anywhere. And at that moment, I felt something shift, and I decided to try a different approach. So I tried to postpone my judgment about what he had done and tried to ask him questions about who he was as a person. So I chose to calm my breath, lean back to give him some space. And I asked, when I see these images, I can't rhyme them with the person sitting in front of me. I can't understand what happened here. Can you please try to help me understand what was going on? And I knew this tone was out of line and that it was unusual to ask questions in this way. And the 3 judges sort of leaned over and looked at me like, what are you doing? But the change in the defendant was so striking that even I was taken aback by it, because he softened, this hard man softened, and tears rolled down his face as his shame made way for sadness. And he explained that he had suffered so much beating as a child that he had no other way to channel his fear of losing his wife than through aggression. Now, of course, this didn't excuse his actions or provide any legitimation for it, but it did help us understand better what had happened. And this is important, because if we can't understand what really happened, we can't find the right punishment, and we can't look towards the future, and we can't provide the solace and the healing that is needed for both defendants and the victims and the community around them. So this place took place some 10 years ago. And since then, much has changed in my outlook. I still feel the discomfort sometimes, but I consistently look to balance fact and rationality on the one hand, with emotion and empathy on the other. I want my court hearings to be as effective and as impactful as they could possibly be. One victim that I met in court, that I later interviewed for my first book, she explained that the hearing for her was like a kind of ritual, like the way a funeral or a wedding might be. It was a moment that marked a point in her life from which she could move on for. And she said that this was because she felt seen and heard, and because she could sense that her suffering touched us as human beings. Being so close to human suffering in various forms, witnessing the universal need for recognition and belonging has gotten me thinking. As soon as I put on my toga, I become a representation of an institution. I become the embodiment of our trade for freedom, for security. But I am still a human being with that same need for recognition and belonging as everybody else. I can't separate those two aspects of myself, and I don't believe that anyone in this room can. All of us in this room have been formed by our relationships, by the emotional reactions that other people have towards us, and that we have to them. We have been shaped by the emotional availability of the people around us and their ability to see us, to affirm us, and to help us understand the world around us. As children and as adolescents, and even as adults today, we exist by the grace of our relationships with others. Now, this might sound evidentiary, but if that is so, then why do the institutions and political bodies that govern how we live our collective lives together not reflect that kind of emotional availability? Why is there no understanding of the importance of relationships in the interaction between government and citizen, between the way we rule society and those that are ruled by it? I think we can all think of examples, experienced by ourselves or others, where we have not felt seen or heard by our governing bodies. Not just by a judge in court, but by an inflexible tax authorities, unyielding municipalities, or heartless migration officers. Perhaps you're familiar with the British Post scandal or the child support scandal in the Netherlands, where unassuming citizens were marked as frauds based on discriminatory policies. The intransigence of the government organizations prevented them from seeing what damage they were doing, and the risk of suffering was taken for granted. Citizens are dependent on people on the front line, people like myself, to implement policies in a way that relates to their individual lives. Policymakers need us to execute policies in a way that serves society and reflects the underlying values that are of a certain regulation. And as people in the front line, we need policymakers, people like you, to create regulations that make it possible for us to do that kind of work, to actually serve our citizens. And let's not forget that the directors and policymakers, people such as yourselves, are citizens too, subject to the laws and moral codes that govern the way we live together and dependent on the protection that they provide. We are all interdependent in this way. So what I experience as someone in the front lines, forming the physical link between government and the citizen, is that the faith that the people have in the institutions is dependent and determined by their actual interactions with it. Politicians, and I mean this in the kindest way, spend so much time trying to figure out what their constituents want and then phrasing it back to them in a way that fits their own political agenda. So what becomes visible on the surface is the rhetoric. Well, we tend to think that there is a separation between the political ideas and the policies on the one hand, and the work of the institutions on the other hand. But the proof of the pudding is in the eating, not in political rhetoric or in the reports, but in the actual execution of those plans. And we can pretend that this is a solely rational, distantiated process, but so long as human beings are taking those decisions, emotion will be involved. Now, as far as I'm concerned, this line of thinking goes beyond the usual paradigm of individual freedom versus collective care. And it brings us to the very core of what it means and what it takes to be a human being living in a collective society. The central theme of the Friends of Europe strategy is the redefinition of the social contract. And the most fundamental principle underlying that contract is that we trade some of our freedom for security. But what kind of security are we getting if that is mainly based on control and repression? Now, while that may well work in a crisis situation to provide short-term security, on a day-to-day basis, it will not help us thrive. We have built a society based on rationality, emotional control, with the idea that this will bring us predictability and one-size-fits-all solutions. Our bureaucracy has historically been shaped through the colonial efficiency, the scientific rejection of emotions through enlightenment, and the capitalization of new public management. Through the past centuries, government has taken form as a distantiated, centralized body struggling to relate to its citizens. And if we continue to build our bodies, our societal bodies, on mistrust and fear, that's what we will get back from our citizens. I think there's no way to conclude fully that the rise of the far right and populism in Europe has been facilitated by the lack of vision or sensibility of the pragmatic and managerial government since the 80s. And I realize that for our colleagues living with the inheritance of communist and authoritarian regimes, there are many more factors at play. And yet, people feeling that laws and policies are not made for them have them hankering for someone that at least says that they matter. Martha Nussbaum writes, "Sometimes people think that only fascist or aggressive societies are intensely emotional, and that only such societies need to focus on taming such emotions. These kinds of ideas are incorrect and dangerous. All societies need to think about compassion with suffered losses, about anger towards injustice, and about the hampering of envy and aversion in favor of a general concern for the well-being of others. If we don't pay attention to emotion, that provides a great opportunity for anti-liberal forces to conquer the hearts of peoples, with the risk that people will find liberal values weak and boring. We need to understand that emotions and relationships deserve a place in our political policies and subsequently in the actual execution of those public services. Not swept up frantic emotions of anger or fear, but real complex human emotions, like the relief of being understood, the loneliness of having caused suffering, and the hope of getting better. I think that the only real way to do that is to connect to the people that we are serving through empathy. Perhaps eventually systemic changes will be more necessary, but for now, I would say that a change in outlook towards the role of emotions and relationships could already benefit us a great deal. My discrimination team and I recently visited the newly opened Holocaust Museum in Amsterdam. And across the walls, for anyone who's been, but across the walls, they've plastered every regulation and rule that was put in place between 1940 and 1945. Every day, a new rule was adapted, often seemingly small regulations, like the prohibition for Jewish people to get a mortgage or send letters. But what I saw there on those walls was the complete lack of empathy, because each and every one of those regulations had to be implemented to have any effect. Every banker who denied them a mortgage, every postal officer that didn't send them letters. Thankfully, we are not yet at this point, although we witness the rights of minorities across Europe being limited. I believe that we are at a point, at a fork in the road, as was said yesterday, where we can allow empathy, fueled by courage, to be our guiding force. To do so, though, we need to first tap into our own emotions, our own understanding of relationships. If we allow every decision we make to be an expression of that understanding, we can have a direct impact on the people around us. And if we speak about it, if we share our stories of the moment when we choose courage over comfort and love over fear, we invite others to do the same. This is what I've tried to do with you today, and I will continue to do so in all my discrimination cases. So what about you? Will you choose courage over comfort? Will you choose love over fear? My invitation to you is to bring empathy and self-awareness into the way you create policies and set out your vision. Because if you do, I believe that you have the power to build resilient, thriving human institutions. Thank you.